The other question, I think, united front, the idea of a united front. It's somewhat misunderstood in the sense that people think, you know, Malcolm became an integrationist,
Right.
you know, some people say that. He never gave up his black nationalism precept, his insistence on self-determination and self-knowledge as the foundation for black people, and I would say any people, to function in this system that we're in. He always chafed against the restrictions of the Nation of Islam to be involved with politics and with other groups. And he always kept black nationalism and the idea of uniting with other groups and uniting with other progressive forces in front of him, and certainly through the OAAU in the last months of his life. And the idea of human rights as central, you know, related to that. And I would just say that, you know, going broader with the work that you're talking about, that the black left in general, that community leaders, civil rights movement, anti-war, youth, the influence of all this was central to his developing thought and understanding, and that's also something that we can learn from and study how he was going to do that united front and where it came up, you know, and how he approached that. The other last thing I'll say, okay, 2 more seconds.
The egg is boiled.
One of his most important contributions, I think, is his giving us the understanding of racism as a national, international, global system. I think that was one of the most important contributions to the liberation struggle. And the idea of being able to do systematic analyses of the conditions under which we live. And that is something that I think must apply now to the anti-immigration movement, to Islam, to Occupy Wall Street, to what's happening to black and brown youth, to the environmental movement, all of this. And I will stop there.
Our next 20-minute speaker is Maulana Karenga.
My name is Maulana Karenga. I'm professor, chair of the Department of Africana Studies, Cal State University, Long Beach. I'm also chair of the organization, us, and executive director of the African American Culture Center and of the National Association of Kawida Organization. What I want to do is talk about Malcolm and some of the things that Manning said, which were incorrect, but most of all to real. Pardon me.
You didn't get that much time.
Some of them. So I want to just talk on Malcolm X, real, not invented. Remembrance and right for reading. The life and legacy of Minister Malcolm X, El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz, weighs heavy in the scales of African and human history, measured as a mountain weight against the leaf-like and less than notable lives of his would-be detractors. Malcolm is a multidimensional Imhotepian man, offering models and messages of a rich and timeless value. He's a model master teacher, student, model organizing, critical thinker, a model revolutionary, and a model of black manhood in the most moral, mental, and cooperatively practiced ways. Moreover, he is rightly conceived of and honored as a soldier servant of the people and a moral teacher. Thus, his measured meaning lies in his written and oral teachings, as well as his living practice texts, which provide us numerous models and messages of infinite and enduring value, of which only a few can be identified and discussed here. Malcolm comes into consciousness and active commitment at a fundamental time of turning for our people, this country, and indeed the world. This is the awesome decade of the 60s in which liberation struggles reached around and engulfed the globe. Malcolm, reading the Signs of Time, says, quote, "We are living in a world where great changes are taking place. Moreover, our present generation is witnessing the end of colonialism, Europeanism, Westernism, and whiteism. In fact, the end of white supremacy," unquote. In other words, he tells and teaches us, quote, "We are living in an era of revolution, and the revolt of the African American is part of the rebellion against oppression and colonialism, which has characterized this era. And through this process, And though this process is still unfolding with bumps, bad faith, betrayals, diversions, and setbacks, the struggle does continue. Mary McLeod Bethune taught us that the measure of our progress as a race is in precise relation to the depth of faith in our people held by our leaders, unquote. Therefore, she says, we must never forget their sufferings and their sacrifices, for they were the foundation of the progress of our people, unquote. Such is the status and contribution and the remembrance, respect, and rightful reading of Malcolm X. For Malcolm begins his project in practice with love of and faith in his people. He will not confuse individual ascension or personal success or respect with justice, respect, and success for the people. He says, quote, no matter how much respect, no matter how much recognition whites show toward me, as far as I'm concerned, as long as it's not shown to every one of our people, it doesn't exist for me, unquote. The measured meaning of Malcolm is rooted first and foremost then in his conception of and commitment to his people, to Africans at home and abroad, here in the larger diaspora and on the continent. He wants them to learn their history, question their religion for its relevance to lived life, and to view and value themselves as possessors of dignity and divinity, worthy of ultimate respect, and having within themselves the capacity and courage to examine and alter their lives in productive, progressive, and promising ways. It is important to note that in his commitment to Third World Alliance and struggle and to the human project of freedom and flourishing, he argues that within our concern for the world, one must always and rightly start with one's own people and develop from that a world-encompassing conception of one's obligation and practice. Quote, he says, I can state in all sincerity that I wish nothing but freedom, justice, equality, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for all people. He writes this in the Egyptian Gazette. However, quote again, the first law of nature's self-preservation, so my first concern is the oppressed group of people to which I belong, the 22 million African American, unquote. Malcolm is concerned that we understand ourselves and our humanity in expansive ways, not only as part of the rising rebellious and revolutionary tide of history, but also as bearers of dignity and divinity, again, worthy of the highest respect and equal and inalienable right, and to fight fiercely and uncompromisingly for them. Quote, he says, we're fighting for the right to live as free human beings. We declare our right on this earth to be a man, to be a human being, to be respected as a human being, to be given rights as a human being in this society, on this earth, in this day, which we intend to bring into existence by any means necessary, unquote. Malcolm as a moral teacher also taught us to think deeply and to think in self-determined ways as an ethical obligation. He tells an audience of African-American college students, quote, one of the first things I think young people nowadays should learn is how to see for themselves, listen for themselves, and think for yourself, unquote. Ever mindful of the awesome burden of history placed on each generation and the critical juncture at which they stood, he continues saying to them, quote, this generation, especially of our people, has a burden more than any other time in history. Thus, unquote. Thus he concludes emphasizing, quote, that the most important thing that we can do is to think for ourselves. Indeed, like Frantz Fanon and Sekou Touré, he knew that the decolonized mind precedes and makes possible political decolonization, even if the process continues after liberation. And finally, Malcolm stresses a cultural return to Africa and a Pan-Africanism that reflects culture and political consciousness and active commitment. This also meant reaffirming our humanity by embracing our Africanity, waging, as he says, a cultural revolution, quote, to recapture our heritage and identity if we're ever to liberate ourselves, unquote. Indeed, quote again, the cultural revolution would be a journey to rediscover ourselves in our excellence, achievement, and possibility. And it would mean returning to the source, Africa, quote, mentally, culturally, spiritually, philosophically, and psychologically, unquote. Malcolm called was for Africans to, quote, wake up, clean up, and stand up. And when he was asked, wake up to what? He answered, quote, wake up to their humanity, to their worth, and to their heritage, unquote. that equally valid and valuable way of being African and human in the world, for ourselves and for the world. For again, we must free the heart and mind and imagine and create new ways of being African and human in the world. In some, he offers a model message of jihad, the righteous internal and external struggle reflected in his own self-sacrificing life, which has become a sacred text and testimony of our capacity and obligation to constantly strive to transform, repair, and remake the world in the process of transforming, repairing, and remaking ourselves in the most laudable and liberational way. I met Malcolm in the early 60s at March 27, and he invited me afterwards and some other students to come to the Shabazz restaurant where we talked for hours. Afterwards, seeing I had no way home, he himself drove me home, and we continued our discussion on a wide range of conversations about race, religion, revolution, and the obligation to struggle. We also, as part of the BSU of UCLA, brought him to campus, and later he invited me to be MC at a memorial for Brother Ronald Stokes, who was shot down by the police in Los Angeles. I developed in this process a deep appreciation for Malcolm's thought and practice, and when he was martyred, we as an organization raised our organization, us, in his name. After he was martyred, we were one of the first people to stand up and declare a holiday for him called Dabihu. And a lot of people were afraid because of the FBI and the Muslims.
That's right.
And we stood up and declared his martyrdom, a sacrifice for human liberation in the world. We also declared his holiday Dabihu. And at that same time, Kuzaliwa, I'm sorry, for his birthday. And also we, in this Dabihu ceremony, also gave homage to Patrice Lumumba. Patrice Lumumba, Asante. At the same time, we also brought Betty out of New York for the first time to speak in Los Angeles for our organization, us. And we saw ourselves as heirs and descendants of Malcolm. Not only in the same way that all nationalists do, but in a deeper, more intellectual, philosophically, and organizationally based way. And we carried his legacy and have not in any way changed. It is in this context that we make a critical assessment of Manning Marble's problematic work. Every work reflects, consciously or unconsciously, a philosophical framework within which it is rooted, conceived and carried out, no matter what claims are made about objectivity and detached critical analysis. And Manning Marble's recent posthumously published and problematic book on the life of Malcolm X, El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz is not exempt from this rule of reality. Indeed, Manning's book and the subsequent controversy of denunciation and praise which surrounds it raises larger questions beyond the book about how we understand, interpret, and write history. It also raises interrelated questions of how we address the tendency of so many black intellectuals to embrace the deconstructionist approach to history and humanities writing, pursuing criticism as an act of faith and revelation of the unseemly as proof of progress toward humanizing quote-unquote persons thought to be in need of it. Clearly, the deconstructive writing as critical analysis is something we embrace. In fact, Black studies came into being as a questioning and a proposed corrective for the established order. But deconstructionism is Black studies and the Black movement, of course. But deconstructionism is in its most negative form, can easily degenerate into collecting and musing over trivia, trash, and other extraneous information whose sensationalist character becomes a substitute for things relevant and more intellectually rewarding. Indeed, it becomes little more than a passionate pursuit of racialized pathology by another name. At its worst, it takes the form of scavenger history, the constant search for stench and stain, bottom feeding on the salacious, unseemly, and sensational. This leads to pretensions and claims of revealing new material and offering original sights in things found earlier by others and rejected as uninstructive and unuseful to a more disciplined and rigorous scholarship. It is Malcolm himself who affirmed, quote, "Of all our studies, history is best prepared to reward our research." But this is the Malcolmian critical thinking tradition, and it assumes a mind receptive to discovery, not one determined to prove preconception. And it presupposes an emancipatory intent in pursuit of knowledge, not one that binds the mind in even tighter conceptual chain forged and offered as liberational tools by the established order. As Malcolm noted in a lecture at Harvard, the logic of the oppressed cannot be the logic of the oppressor if they seek liberation. Marble embraced the deconstructionist approach to life of Malcolm X as one of repeated reinvention, as the title of the book suggested. It can be understood as an expression, pardon me, he calls Malcolm's life a reinvention. It is this academically faddish and popular culture category, reinvention, that informs and problematizes Marble's work, for it can be understood as either an expression of agency or an expression of indictment. Thus, it can reflect creative and constructive change or manipulative masking and shape-shifting in the most indictable kind. It is also Malcolm in his autobiography who defined the positive self-constructive change of his life. He said, my whole life has been a chronology of changes. So it's not that he's scared of changes. I have to skip here. It's really in the tradition of Oduifa that says, if we are given birth, we should bring ourselves into being again. So this represents human agency, the capacity to shape ourselves in the most meaningful and flourishing manner. Malcolm is portrayed as a wily, having multiple masks. Okay, well, I don't have to. Let me go past that. Marble tells us that he and his researchers and perhaps co-writers of sections wanted to, quote, humanize Malcolm, a kind of saving him from his manufactured self and from the alleged mythological conceptions we who respect him have of Malcolm. But it's important to know how these humanizers really mean, what they really mean by the self-assigned and sanctimonious sounding mission of humanizing Malcolm. In such a conception, the flaws of the defining feature of Malcolm's being human and his excellence assume secondary relevance. We reject that accord. Malcolm, he goes through so many complications and says so many contradictions. I had described it as, in too many places, it calls to mind a diligent but mistaken scholar trying to translate a Swahili text with a Zulu dictionary. Marble's reinvented Malcolm is deconstructed and pieced back together in such a problematic and unproductive way. The project clearly falls short of its goal to provide a corrective for Alex Hagel. Actually, Alex Hagel's autobiography remains a fundamental source for understanding Malcolm. But let me skip to this last part, which is about the rock and reef on which the whole project falls. And it has to do with his limited knowledge of nationalism. Regardless of all the philosophic and factual flaws that weaken and undermine the structure and intellectual integrity of Marble's work, the reef and rock on which his deconstructionist project flounders and is ultimately wrecked is his limited and less than expansive and thus inadequate conception of blackness and black nationalism. He wants to portray blackness and black nationalism as narrow notions needing repair and rehabilitation, if not outright rejection. This is one of the reasons he portrays Malcolm as reaching out to the civil rights leader as a repentant and reformed petitioner rather than an equal, a colleague and ally pursuing the politic of united front as a self-conscious, carefully conceived strategy rooted in a long-held nationalist views and values. But black nationalism is not the reactive practice born of the belief in the impossible assimilation of blacks and Marble's success. On the contrary, nationalism is a profound commitment to community, to peoplehood, and the right and responsibility of a people to exist, to be self-determined, and to define, develop, and defend its members and its interests. Malcolm is renamed an internationalist, as if nationalism in its most expansive and progressive form does not include and require a world-encompassing understanding and ethic. And as if there can be an internationalism without the nations that embrace and practice it. It is Malcolm himself who teaches this expansive conception of black nationalism, not only in his NOI day or early Third World and Bandung day, but also in his last lectures. If you read them, praising the global thinking that characterized the new black consciousness, the black consciousness of the movement, Malcolm states that one of its defining features is that, quote, the thinking is broad, it's more international, unquote. He goes on to say, quote, you find the masses of black people think today in terms of black, and this enables them to think beyond the confines of America, and they look over the world they look all over the world. They look at the happening of the international contact, unquote. Marble also makes a mistake of trying to, and this is one of his worst mistakes, trying to sum up culture nationalism as just liking culture accoutrement and referring to Africa. And what Malcolm argues is that we have to do is recapture our heritage and identity if we're to liberate ourselves. Malcolm talks culture nationalism. We must launch a cultural revolution that frees our hearts and minds and prepares us for and sustains us in the larger liberation struggle. He says culture is an indispensable weapon in the freedom struggle. Moreover, Malcolm says we should keep an open mind necessary to the flexibility which goes hand in hand with every form of intelligent search for truth. Malcolm, by his own definition, was a, quote, a black nationalist freedom fighter. And his nationalism, as defined by my philosophy, Kawaida, is rooted in three major principles and practices: self-determination, self-respect, and self-defense. Self-determination means control of our space, destiny, and daily life in this country and in the world African community. Culture grounding means, self-respect means culture grounding, which affirms our identity and dignity of persons and people. And the right and responsibility, finally self-defense means the right and responsibility to defend ourselves against systemic and social violence and oppression by any means necessary, including armed struggle. It is these concentric circles that are the hinge and hub on which his thought and practice turn. It is these three principles, that we of the organization, us, embrace and use also to define the struggle for black power. As I stated elsewhere, quote, in the 60s, we had stood up seeing ourselves as descendants of Malcolm with an awesome obligation to wage the revolution. Yes, it's good. Yeah. To wage the revolution. Wait a minute. Let me get this sentence out. In the 60s. Thank you, Komozi. As I stated elsewhere, in the 60s, we had stood up seeing ourselves as descendants of Malcolm with an awesome obligation to wage the revolution he has conceived and called for. And we began with culture nationalism. Just quickly, if I can do, culture nationalism is not all these things people do to demonize it. Culture nationalism is thought and practice rooted in three fundamental propositions. Number one, the defining feature of a people is its culture. By culture, I mean the totality of thought and practice by which a people creates itself, celebrates, sustains itself, and introduces itself to history and humanity. Second proposition, that for people to be itself and to free itself, it must be self-conscious, self-determining, and rooted in its own culture. And finally, the third principle is that the quality of life of a people and the success of its liberation struggle depends definitively on its waging a cultural revolution within and a political revolution without, resulting in a radical reconception and transformation of self-society and ultimately the world. Last point, I do not try to humanize Malcolm, but rather seek to understand and interpret his humanity in its most profound and expansive form. And I explored not paths of imagined or possible pathology or flaw, but the ground and applicability of his excellence as expressed in his intellectual and social practice. For in the final analysis, we all engage him, even in criticism, not as a model of flaws and failure, but as a model of excellence achieved against the heavy odds of a history of savage and sustained oppression, and in the radical and relentless struggle for liberation, which forms and grounds his enduring legacy.
Our panelists for the care and preparation they put into this, and I hope you get a lot to think about here. We will now have about 45 minutes of conversation, questions and answers, but I'd like to take the privilege of the chair to ask two questions. One of our panelists, Cheryl, about Paul Zuber. Did you find much about Paul Zuber? Turns out Paul Zuber was the black attorney who did the desegregation suits in Englewood, New Jersey, Harlem, and New Rochelle. And his widow said that Malcolm and Paul Zuber had a secret code to talk, because they knew the FBI were monitoring their discussion. But on the front page of the New York Times, one of the things that wasn't in Manning's book, Malcolm is threatening to enter the Englewood movement to desegregate schools as early as summer '62. That's public record. That's on the front page of the New York Times. And he uses the whole threat that he's going to come in as a big bad wolf to force them to desegregate the schools. So I was just wondering whether you saw any in his archives about that, or whether it was so secret.
I didn't.
Okay.
I mean, it doesn't mean it's not there, because I can get through everything.
And my second question is to Bill Strickland about the, we did a program on the Freedom Riders, and Bob Kervin asked me, when I asked him about the Freedom Rides, Bob Kervin from CORE, I'm sorry, in Newark, which Freedom Rides I was talking about. And he asked me whether I was talking about the one in the South or the one in the North. And he seemed to suggest that the Freedom Rides in the North helped stimulate the Northern movement, the Northern student movement. Can you, you're an expert on this issue, so can you help us out with that thing? I tried to get Kervin to speak, but he wasn't able to make it to our program. But I'm sorry, let me just say this. What we're talking about is that they said they want to desegregate all the hotels and restaurants between Boston and Washington, D.C. on Route 1. And that's been left out of the record of the Freedom Rides. I'm sorry?
Route 40.
Route 40, sorry about that.
Route 40, that was an integrated structure. Students, that was part of the contradiction of the time. As Maulana was saying, as nations in Africa became independent, and they established,
Can't hear you, Bill.
as they established offices in embassies in New York and at the UN, and also offices in Washington, D.C., they would travel back and forth between New York and Washington. And because I almost said the crackers, that's what they did. So because the enemies of the race didn't distinguish between them and us, they were refused service. And that became a big incident for the Kennedys. So you had integrated groups of students who themselves went down Route 40. Largely the issue of the contradiction of fighting for the free world while the newly emancipated nation was being treated like black people in Mississippi. The other thing is, I don't see any connection except to the extent that Bayard Rustin has been involved with James Farmer with the Freedom Rides during World War II. Bayard was a major influence on all of us, and especially on Stokely and other folks who were in the North when Bayard was doing the school boycott. So he would talk about what the struggles that had taken place in World War II. There's no connection between those and what happened in the South, organically.
Okay, because I've talked to the, I forget the brother's name right now, who produced the film. I don't know what, my brain's not working. And he said he didn't know about the Northern one. So that's why it wasn't in the documentary. But
Oh,
Stanley Buss, right. But that's part of this, you know, Malcolm's forte, as far as I'm concerned, is he exposed the Jim Crow North, right? And the Jim Crow West, Midwest, and all that, right? So I think that's one of the reasons he was shut up, was because he didn't want to talk about it as a confined thing that was going on in Mississippi. Because he said, what? On the south of the Canadian border. And up there they say, even north of the Canadian border, they would say, you've got the problem there. Here's our first question.
Well, I was confirming what the brother in the back had said about what was going down on Route 40. I was a young man who was growing up in the state of Virginia at the time. That was before I got to California, Maulana. And it was a major source of embarrassment for the U.S. government. As many African nations had gained their independence, they had embassies in Washington, and they were traveling back and forth, and these segregated restaurants refused to serve them, and it caused a big international incident. And so the State Department, this is